One of the big worries with climate change is that the Gulf Stream is going to get interrupted, and all that lovely Caribbean water, it's not going to make Britain that warm tropical place we know it is. It's going to get even chillier, colder, worse. That'll happen to the whole northern hemisphere in theory. The whole thing will get more chilly-willy. Interestingly, this did happen relatively recently in human history, and I want to dig into some cool papers about it. What happened? How bad was it? And how did humans respond? The archaeology, the sweet, sweet archaeology. So this graph here, I believe, shows the surface air temperature above Greenland. And as you can see, right in the middle of this graph, there's a bit of a dip. There's a dip of like -3, -4 degrees at the worst. To put that in perspective, you know when you see like some early modern paintings of European cities and they're skating on rivers and stuff? That was during this phenomenon called the Little Ice Age, I think, which sort of happened on and off between the 15th and 19th century. That was a cooling of 0.6 degrees. So -3 degrees, definitely a bummer, definitely a noticeable shift in the climate. I saw this cool paper as well, the timing, duration, and magnitude at 8.2 kilo-anno event in global speleotherm records. Speleotherms is stalagmites and stalactites. It's another graph. Let's see the graph. So as you can see here, they've annotated it, this 8.2 kilo-anno event. 70% of the speleotherms, stalagmites, stalactites, showed a climate change during that time. What did the author write? The authors of that paper state, it is the most coherent signal of abrupt climate change during the last 12,000 years. And yeah, as you saw from the title, it's called the 8.2 kilo-year event, kilo-anno year event. Basically, 8,200 years ago, a little bit before that, a little bit after that, the climate went rubbish for like 300 years-ish. What caused it? Well, seemingly, all those ocean currents being interrupted. So 8.2 thousand years ago, there was a lot more ice on the Earth than there is today, but it had been pretty consistently melting for several thousand years. I think the last glacial maximum was 25,000 years ago. That's when the ice was at its highest extent. And definitely since the end of the Younger Dryas 12,000 years ago, the climate had been warmer, stable. It's this period called the Holocene. It's the period we now live in, although maybe our actions have sort of ended the Holocene, who knows? So yeah, these glaciers have been melting for basically thousands of years. All that water's got to go somewhere. Some of it is just slowly dribbling into the ocean, but some of it is forming enormous lakes. There's one in North America called Lake Agassiz. Agassiz, no relation to the tennis player. You can see the rough outline of it here on this map, basically spanned from like South Dakota and Minnesota all the way up into Saskatchewan. Apparently it covered about 170,000 square miles, would be way bigger than any lake today, approximately the size of the Black Sea. Black Sea-sized lake going on in North America. Huge, huge body of water. All of this water was prevented from reaching the ocean in the Hudson's Bay by the glaciers that are melting. But obviously, each year they're melting, getting weaker and weaker, and each year that lake is getting bigger and bigger. Something's going to snap, right? There's something going to be out of balance there. And yeah, it seems like it gave way about 8,200 years ago and dumped all that water into the Hudson Bay. One interesting thing, there was glacial floods here on the west coast in Oregon where I am, and they formed like the channeled scablands and the Columbia River Gorge and all of these things, and the Willamette Valley, all the nice farmland in the Willamette Valley. Is there something like that on the east coast that I'm totally unaware of? Did all this water create some crazy geological features over there? I'm not sure. Let me know. Not so confident in my geography in that part of the world. Let me know if I'm missing out on some cool geography there. But yeah, all this cold water dumped into the Atlantic Ocean, interrupted the Gulf Stream, Northern Hemisphere gets colder, drier, and it seems like it caused a 300-year megadrought. What makes something a megadrought? Let's see. Okay, a multi-decade drought. Okay, well, yeah, it did last for multiple decades. It lasted for 300 years. Mega drought confirmed. Interesting. I know I probably shouldn't take Google AI's answer, but just for the sake of the video, I am. Bit of a bummer. I certainly don't want to live through a drought. I certainly don't want to live through a mega drought. And yeah, people did, of course. People did. Many people did. 300 years, that's multiple people's lifetimes. Do we have any evidence in the archaeological record of people reacting to that? The interesting thing about 8.2 thousand years ago is that it is kind of this crucial time in prehistory. The majority of the world is still hunting and gathering, as humans had been for all of evolution. But some farming communities had sprung up by that time, and they were sort of a few thousand years old, and they were starting to expand. It's sort of like the early expansion of Neolithic farmers. Kind of interesting, especially in Western Asia. But I think probably we also see the start of farming communities other places around the world too. But definitely in Western Asia, farming communities established for a few thousand years, they're starting to expand. Before I get to that, though, I want to start with the hunter-gatherers. Is there any evidence of hunters and gatherers adapting to this change? And that's where this first study comes in. It's basically the paper that inspired this whole video. I came across it whilst I was researching my Doggerland video. Just came out last week-ish. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. That doesn't fit for Doggerland. But I'm going to have to find an excuse to talk about it, so here we are. Radiocarbon dating from Yuzhny Oleny Ostrov Cemetery reveals complex human responses to socio-ecological stress during the 8.2 kilo anno cooling event. Cool title. I'm just going to call this place Yuzhny Cemetery for ease. It's a really fascinating site. It's a small island on the side of Lake Onega, about 5 hours drive north of St. Petersburg, just the Russian side of the Finnish border, basically. Yuzhny Oleny Ostrov actually means Southern Reindeer Island, which is very cool. In the 1930s, archaeologists found a Mesolithic cemetery here, hunter-gatherer cemetery. 177 bodies were found all in all, which is a lot. And because of quarrying on the island, they think it could have had even more. It could have potentially had 400 bodies there at this Mesolithic cemetery. That's really, really unique. I can't think of another example, at least in Europe, a Mesolithic cemetery, hunting and gathering community cemetery with that many people in. I'm not saying there isn't one. If there is one, I'd love to know. Please leave it in the comments. But I think that's definitely unusual. That's definitely not typical. So right from the get-go, this site is odd. There's interestingly different treatment of the bodies too. I think there might be some different orientations that they're placed in. Some of these graves are super ornate though. Heads, hundreds and hundreds of beads, pendants, trinkets, some of them even made out of human bones. This one here, this is a human bone. In a study of 37 pendants from this cemetery, 12 of them came back as human, using that Zoo MS thing that I mentioned in Doggerland as well. Lots of human jewelry going on in this time period. Human bones being turned into tools and jewelry in this time period. There's some symbolism there. I know there's some symbolism there going on. But the question for archaeologists, right, is like, are these differences in treatment a sign of different cultures? Or is this all happening at the same time and maybe this is evidence of social hierarchy or something else going on, right? And then it kind of all depends on how closely these burials seem to have occurred in time. If they're separated by centuries and centuries and centuries, these could just be different groups expressing themselves differently. If they're all together, close in time, something's going on, right? That's where this paper came in, the radiocarbon dating. It seems that all of these burials, or at least the ones tested in the study, date to between 8,250 to 8,000 years ago, right at the heart of this climatic stress. We don't have any cemeteries preceding this, any big cemeteries preceding this. After this period of climatic stress, it seems this cemetery is no longer used. So what's going on, right? What about this specific time is causing people to bury all their loved ones on this lakeside island? On the one hand, we don't know, probably. But we can come up with a hypothesis, right? We can come up with a reasonable hypothesis. So life during this big drought is going to get harder, right? It's going to get harder. It's going to get trickier, especially if you're relying a lot on animals, big animals like reindeer, perhaps, that are moving through the landscape. They might sort of migrate out of your region, or they might sort of congregate closer to large bodies of water. Key factor is Lake Onega here is one of the two biggest lakes in the region. These are way bigger than all the other lakes in the area. So if some of these lakes getting smaller, drying up, perhaps, animals are going to start congregating next to this bigger lake. The other factor that's going to happen if it's getting colder and colder is that this big, deep lake, probably deep enough that the fish can survive all winter, even when the lake is frozen over for months at a time. Whereas smaller lakes, they get frozen over. Maybe they're getting frozen over for 6 months. Who knows, in this cold spell, the fish are going to die. So probably, quite likely, there's going to be a concentration of resources around this lake, animals and fish. Whereas previously, they were perhaps more spread out in the landscape. Obviously, humans who need fish, need reindeer, need stuff like that, they're now going to congregate at this lake too. So how do all these tribes, all these groups who were once pretty spread out in the landscape, negotiate access to the lake, sort of decide who has access to the lake, stake their claim to the lake. This is in a period long before writing, long before land deeds, titles, private property, anything like that. How do you mark your territory? Maybe you mark it with burials. Maybe you try to create the largest, most elaborate burials possible to show just how connected you are to this lake. Could be something like that on the go. This is not like a new sort of idea in archaeology. It tends to be, at least from my perspective, studying British archaeology at university, we tend to think about it more with the Neolithic farmers. For the first time in British prehistory, Neolithic farmers are building these elaborate tombs, communal tombs. And one idea in archaeology is because now people have to tie themselves specifically to a piece of land, how do you show ownership of this land? How do you connect yourself to this land? Through the fact that your literal ancestors are buried right on it. And so perhaps something like that is happening in this hunter-gatherer community up in Russia. They're not congregating around a specific piece of land to farm, they're congregating around a specific piece of land because maybe these large, deep lakes in this time period are the best place to be. In this period of drought, cold drought, this deep lake might be where it's at. And if you're related to the people that are buried there, then who's to say you don't have access to it, right? Who's to say? It's just a hypothesis, but it's a reasonable one. I don't think it's a crazy one. I don't think it's a crazy one at all. And it probably is a sign, if they're having to go to perhaps this length to mark territory, if that is what's happening, that there's a lot of social stress going on, that there's a lot of tension and conflict perhaps between these people who were once very spread out in the landscape and are now finding themselves living in much closer proximity, sharing the similar resources. I think that's a recipe for conflict. These burials are probably a sign of strife. That's a great word, strife. That's the hypothesis anyway. Feel free to argue about it in the comments. The good thing about hunter-gatherer communities is that they are probably more resilient to climate change because they, do simply follow resources through the landscape. They are not tied so much to any particular area. Hunter-gatherers also have smaller communities. For farmers, this is harder. They tend to live in bigger communities. They tend to get attached to the land for at least a year, at least a growing season. It's hard to kind of move around when you're a farmer. What's happening to them? What's happening to them? I will say, in looking into this, there's a lot more debate about how the farmers are reacting than how hunter-gatherers are reacting. Now, when I was looking into this, there seems to be quite a big debate about what's happening in the Neolithic during this time period. On the one hand, people argue that this is quite bad for farming communities, quite devastating. Farming communities are attracting, cultural periods are ending, maybe farmers being pushed into new areas. And on the other side, people are arguing, well, maybe they're more resilient than we think. Maybe it's a more complicated picture. Let's start with this site anyway. Çatalhöyük, super famous Neolithic village, incredibly well-preserved site. Even 9,000-year-old wall paintings survive, which is fantastic, really. Doesn't really get any better than that. At its height, probably about 2,000 to 3,000 people probably lived here. And get this, there were no roads. This is my favorite fact about Çatalhöyük. There were no roads. Urbanism had started kind of with, building permanent settlements, the very start of urbanism, but it's like urbanism pre-road. Seems like people accessed these buildings through the roofs. Very cool, very cool. Bring back human-centered roof clambering in our urban design. Not just bikes. Come on. You gotta advocate for roof clambering. Yeah, another famous thing about Çatalhöyük are these bull shrines, seemingly. Bulls seem to be very important to them. There's also bull murals. But it seems about 8,200 years ago, the bulls were in trouble. Seems like there's a big decline in the bones of these animals, and many of the bones that we have perhaps show stress, nutritional stress in these animals. Community seems to be switching to using much, much smaller animals. There is also argued to be a much more intense focus on the breaking of bones with marrow inside them. Maybe this is a sign of nutritional stress. They're really having to use every part of the animal. I do wonder if we can really say that for sure, because my initial impression is that these early farming communities, hunter-gatherer communities, were not wasteful. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong on that. In good times, probably people are lazy and just feasting a little bit. So anyway, it could be argued that this increased focus on marrow extraction, on smaller animals, and seemingly stress of these bovines is going on. There's a sign of agricultural stress here. Around this time, the village also seems to have been nearly abandoned. There's some debate as to whether it was abandoned, but it seems like all, or at least most of the village seems to have picked up and moved 200 meters away, roughly 200 meters west. Why did they do that at this time, 8.2 thousand years ago? I don't know. Is it because their wells have dried up, that the wells they've been using for generations had just been exhausted? They were trying to find more water? Hard to say. The community did survive this time period, just in a slightly different location. But it seems like there's a noticeable change in life here. The diet is shifting. The location of the village is shifting. Is this because of stress? Possibly. The real question is, did they still make statues, voluptuous statues? That's the real question here. Did that cultural tradition survive the 8.2 kilo anno event? I hope so. I hope for their sakes it did. They persevered, though. They persevered. How much of a stress was it for them? Seemingly somewhat, but they did persevere. But speaking of persevering, though, was this 8.2 kilo anno event actually responsible for farming communities expanding into Europe? Not entirely, not 100%. Farmers had already been established in Greece by this time period. But was this change in climate kind of allowing them to expand at a quicker rate? Check this out. This is another paper. Changes in climate drove vegetation and land use dynamics at the onset of farming in Europe. Cool title. This is Lake Limni-Zazari. It's in Greek Macedonia, not North Macedonia. I did have to double check that when I see Macedonia. So a team of archaeologists did like a lake core study of the climate throughout history alongside this lake. Before the 8.2 event, the region was home to like deciduous oak forest. But drier conditions starting around 8.6 and lasting up until 8,000 years ago kind of created a more open grassland environment. And this is exactly when farming arrived in this region. That sort of makes sense. These agro-pastoral communities, it's hard for them to set up shop in a deciduous forest. You kind of need to do a lot of deforestation before you can start farming. But an open grassland, where your animals can graze, where your crops can grow, this is basically the environment that farming developed in the Near East, in Anatolia. So it makes sense. If there's stress, right? If there's stress in their communities, if maybe they're looking for greener pastures, they're going to expand into this kind of environment. It's an environment that their crops and their animals are already well adjusted to. Let's put it like that. It doesn't require any further evolution of plants and animals to live in that kind of climate. It's an interesting one. Was this event ultimately responsible for the expansion of farming into Europe, or at least sped up that process, helped that process? Yeah. Very interesting. I don't really have any more to say. I've just been reading a lot about it in researching that Doggerland video, and I just want to share it with you. I suppose I feel the pressure to make a political point as we're talking about climate change. I mean, I do obviously think we need to address climate change. That is, a big emergency in our time. I will say, regardless of how stressful it was for those hunter-gatherers around that lake, and for any farming communities in the Near East, whether, it was forcing them to change their habits, whether it was forcing them into new areas. People back then were incredibly resourceful. They all lived off the land, whether they were farmers or hunter-gatherers, they all lived off the land. Every single person on the entire planet knew how to gather food from their environment. That is not the case right now. And there are billions of people who cannot simply just migrate to another region. So, yeah, if I have a political point, it's that we should probably address climate change because you're not as good at farming as someone from Çatalhöyük, and we can't easily adjust. I don't want to have to start marking decent fishing holes with burials, man, with elaborate burials. I don't have any human bone pendants to put in there. Okay, thank you, goodbye.